All right, we're going to start. We're just on time. First of all, it's going to be really hot in this room. So if you put your jackets off, no offense. I think we're also going to do the same. Somewhere during our debate, we're going to put the jackets off, okay? So hope everybody's okay with that. If it becomes too hot, please do that. So dear excellencies, distinguished guests, dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us on this sunny afternoon, and welcome to our panel titled Economic Outlook Before the Fall. If we play with the words a little, we are gathered in our wonderful Alpine Pearl on what is probably one of the last warm summer weeks, as the fall is just behind the corner. Will the word fall be just a meteorological one, or are we bound for a fall or perhaps even winter, also in economic and financial perspective? How many times in the last 2 days have we heard the following? We are living in uncertain and unstable times. The world order built on universal accepted rules has virtually disappeared. We're facing countless shocks, both in the economic and financial sectors, from disturbances in supply chains, inflation growth, currency shocks, and spikes in interest rates, to multiple rises in fuel and food prices. The rare earth war and other trade wars even indicate a possibility of an emerging new global trade system. Here are a few facts and grounds for our panel's discussion. At the beginning of the year, the macroeconomic landscape was significantly different from today. The US and Eurozone economies were expected to grow at around twice their potential rates. Emerging markets were closing the gaps. Economies were healing from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the narrative was centered around what type of V the recovery would resemble and what the new steady state would look like. Inflation was elevated, but seen as largely transitory. Since then, things have changed, and not for the better. Russia has invaded Ukraine, and energy and food prices have spiraled and accelerated the rise in global inflation. The main twist has been the about face of the inflation narrative. With the wisdom of hindsight, central banks are now viewed as having waited perhaps too long to raise rates, putting too much weight on supply-side explanations, or putting too much weight on labor market outcomes, or both. In haste, they're being forced to reverse a decade of unconventional monetary policy, just as a slowdown in growth and heightened recession risks are spreading around the United States and Europe. And further, recently bolstered government transfers may cushion the adverse impact of inflation on the vulnerable households. However, the growing headwinds are poised to constrain the already weakened budgetary positions around and across the world. And last but not least, Fed's chair, Jeremy Powell, has just made clear a few days ago in Jackson Hole, as you all know, in what we can call a rather hawky narrative, that Fed would rise the interest rate again in September by 0.75 percentage point to tackle the biggest inflation in the United States in the last 40 years. And predictions are that the European Central Bank will adopt a decision to rise the interest rate for a similar percentage point on the 8th of September, which is in about a week, in what will already be the meteorological fall. So our main question will be, in this unstable environment, what fiscal, monetary, and economic strategies and policies should the governments, central banks, and global decision makers, not only in the European Union and in the US, but around the world, adopt? Let me introduce our distinguished guests today. The keynote address will be presented by Mr. Matjaž, Minister of Economic Development and Technology of the Republic of Slovenia. On my right, Mr. Boštjan Vasle, Governor and President of the Governing Board of the Bank of Slovenia. Mr. Bowman is the Vice President for Policy and Partnerships at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Mrs. Katja Lautar, Director General for Economic and Fiscal Policy at the Ministry of Finance of the Republic of Slovenia, Mr. Valerio de Luca, Founder and Executive Chairman, International Academy for Social and Economic Development, Mr. Paul Tang, Member and Chair of the Subcommittee on Tax Matters at the European Parliament, and our keynote listener today, who will address some questions at the very end of the panel, is Mr. Collen Vixen Kelapile, Permanent Representative of Botswana to the United Nations. Welcome, panelists. Thank you for being with us. Welcome, dear guests. Mr. Han, Mr. Minister, I kindly ask you for your keynote address.
Spoštovani gostje, najprej si bom dovolil pozdraviti v slovenščini. Zakaj? Ker se seveda močno zavedam, da slovenski jezik, slovenska kultura, identiteta absolutno pomagata pri rasti ekonomije. My English is not so perfect, but I will do my best. Your Excellencies, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to address you here at the 70th Bled Strategic Forum. The world is sailing in open waters with underwater cliffs, but no reliable charts to navigate safely. The model of development is based on liberalization, globalization, cheap money, and low-cost energy. It has now reached its limits. We all agree that the architecture of the world is changing. What was taken for granted in the past is longer valid today. You know that the inflation is too high, but the economy is slowing down. The prices have increased a lot, especially for energy and food. Many companies are also finding it more difficult to get materials, spare parts, and workers they need for production. The European Central Bank has raised interest rates for the first time in 11 years. More increases are likely in the coming months in order to bring inflation back down. These are only new factors that will influence society in the economy. Slovenia, as a small open economy, is highly dependent on global issues. However, we share common challenges with other EU countries. Our government has reacted in the immediately challenges and proposed a set of broad measures to respond. Mainly we wanted to address risk of higher energy and food price, problems is in the supply chains, and potential shortages of energy products. But these are not the only challenges we are facing. We are addressing the demographic changes, long-term care, health issues, and the shortage of qualified staff. And we must adopt various measures to speed up productivity growth and achieve the green and digital transformation. You know, we are a good path, but we intend to invest in research and innovation, improve the business and innovation environment, invite the business sector to invest in digital, innovation, and green transformation, and improve skills and lifelong learning. This is very important. I firmly believe that we will recover faster if we work together. We have to work on the basis of open, multilateral, transparent market. So we need work together. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy Bled, one of the most beautiful place in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, for your address and the points you made. I think we're going to touch them later on in the discussion. Several of those that you mentioned in your keynote address. But Mr. Governor, if I may start with you with the panel questions. Economic performance in the euro area, in particular in Slovenia in Q1 and Q2, is still sound. However, the growth is slowing down and fears of recessions are clear. What are your expectations regarding economic growth in the euro area and also in Slovenia for this autumn and next year in light of Russian aggression against Ukraine, the energy crisis, and possible stronger waves of the pandemic, please?
Thank you for your questions. Let me start with thanking organizers for inviting me here. BSF is always an event one gladly returns to. And also many thanks to our today moderator for a kind gesture regarding our jackets. Now, for the economic growth which we witnessed in the first half of the year and which we are expecting in the second half of the year, basically my assessment is that we will face three different phases regarding GDP during this year. Of course, we started the year on a very positive note. Many measures which were adopted by ourselves, so by the European Central Bank, measures which were adopted by various governments, and finally successful fight against the pandemic enabled us and our economies to relatively quickly return to pre-crisis level. So what we saw at the beginning of the year was in the whole euro area that we were quickly approaching the levels before the crisis. In Slovenia, we actually reached these levels before the start of the year. So the beginning of the year was marked with a very positive developments. Then, of course, everything changed almost overnight by Russia aggression on Ukraine, and the mood changed. But looking backwards, the first half of the year was still relatively successful, and this is basically due to the restored confidence in our economy, especially to the restored confidence of the citizens, of private consumption, which enabled our economies to grow relatively soundly. And to give you just two figures, for the whole euro area at the moment, we are still witnessing economic growth, which is around 4%, and in Slovenia, the figure is double that.
For Q3?
For Q2.
For Q2.
I'm still talking about the second half of the year. Of course, now looking forward, what were we expecting in the third and the fourth quarter of the year is that we will start to feel the consequences of Russia aggressions and all the effects related to energy prices, related to food prices, also related to the sentiment. And our baseline scenario, our central expectations for this year is that the growth will slow markedly in the second half of the year, but still our nowcasting models for Slovenian economy are still indicating that we will most probably avoid something like a recession, and we will have positive third and third quarter. But of course, the prospects, the dynamic is very clear. The growth will slow down, And how big this slowdown will be is very much dependent on geopolitical developments in eastern part of Europe, what will happen with the energy markets, with the prices of energies, and this will be the key determinant for our economies and then consequently for our labor markets and private consumption, which are of course the main components of economic growth.
Thank you very much. Some of the measures you mentioned, which absolutely helped boost economic growth in Slovenia and elsewhere, also, of course, on the other side, helped or participated in the boosting of inflation. Now, that is a big issue now and a big problem we're talking about at this conference as well. Maybe second question to follow up, when can we expect, in your opinion, inflation to cool down and retreat to the pre-crisis levels? It's a long-term prediction, I know. And what measures will be crucial on the side of the ECB, the national regulators and the governments to do that?
In terms of inflation, the general narrative is very similar to what I just explained regarding the GDP growth. Inflation was very much influenced by factors which are not very usual for economies. First with COVID crisis, and then with the war in Ukraine, which are both events we haven't seen for many years, and not only many years, but many decades. So at the beginning, it was it seems that inflation would be relatively transitory, that it will be affected by these two shocks, but it will slowly disappear. But of course, the reality was or is different, and what we are seeing now is more persistent inflation and also more broad-based inflation. So in terms of expectations for the next quarters and next year, we still expect that we haven't seen the highest numbers for inflation yet, not in Slovenia and not in the whole euro area. We are expecting that during the next quarter or two, the inflation will peak, and then it will start to decline. First very slowly in the first half of the next year, and then more rapidly by the end of the year. So our central forecast is that inflation at the end of the next year will be much slower as compared to the figures we are seeing at the moment. Now, regarding the instruments to fight inflation, maybe I can start with the broad picture. One of course, cannot ignore the facts that we, Bank of Slovenia or ECB as a whole, are responsible for inflation, but there are many other policies and many other factors which are affecting inflation at the moment, and the biggest threat to further developments regarding HICP is, of course, what will happen in Ukraine. And as a consequence with energy prices again and with food prices and so on. But saying that, of course, our main mandate actually is to fight inflation. And what are we doing at the moment? We are slowly going out of the measures we implemented during the pandemic crisis, so-called unconventional measures. We already terminated purchases of assets in the first half of the year, and now we started the process of normalization of our policy in terms of interest rates. We increased our interest rates for the first time in more than a decade just before the summer break, and we clearly stated our intention that we will continue with the process of increasing interest rates during our next 3 monetary sessions, which will take place during this year. So these two instruments are our main instruments to fight inflation: asset purchases and interest rates.
Thank you very much. And all the eyes are turned to the 8th of September, when the decision should be made about the potential increase of the interest rate from the ECB. But we'll come back to that, I'm sure. Mr. Bowman, if I may continue with you, and we're going to go to energy now, a very important topic also for our discussion today. Reshaping energy sources and flows is an important way to tackle the current crisis, tapping new conventional and renewable energy sources for Europe to reduce the dependency on Russia. And we'll be talking about that all 2 days now. What projects do you support in this respect? How fast and how successful do you expect these projects will be? And how fast can then we become energy independent? Please, Mr. Bowman.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me on this panel. And before I answer your question, just a very quick word on the economic context, because I thought your introduction was fascinating, and you're completely right that at the beginning of the year we were talking about how quickly economies would recover from the COVID crisis. Obviously, we're in a very difficult and different situation now, primarily because of the war on the Ukraine and the impact that's had on energy and food prices. But I also think that we are now understanding more some of the longer-term consequences of the COVID crisis, the impact on labour markets, on public finances, on structural changes to the economy, and the kind of pressures we've seen on supply chains. In terms of the energy challenge, which is very significant, and obviously very significant as we look forward to the end of summer and the beginning of winter, I'm sure everyone is very familiar with the EU's plans, the Repower EU initiative, and I think it's quite useful to mention that because it has three different components: the reducing energy consumption, the renewing energy consumption, and the replacing energy consumption. And the EBRD thinking is very much aligned with that. So in terms of the kind of projects and interventions that we are engaged in, first of all, kind of more immediate emergency response, helping some of our countries with liquidity needs, helping them to purchase gas, helping them to increase energy storage. Secondly, and I emphasise this very, very strongly, investing in energy efficiency. We have a great deal of experience over many years investing in energy efficiency projects, and there are very, very significant potential for savings there in all sectors of the economy. Thirdly, investment in gas infrastructure, whether it's storage, interconnectors, LNG terminals, helping to diversify sources of supply away from Russia. And fourthly, I would mention renewable energy, which I think is the real opportunity here, actually. And often when we talk about economic policy, we talk about trade-offs and kind of balancing trade-offs. But when it comes to renewables, you actually have a unique alignment of objectives in terms of climate, economic and security objectives. Renewable energy, wind, solar, can be cheaper than gas or coal energy. Obviously better for the climate, and obviously can be more secure. So I think there's a massive opportunity for investing in renewable energy. Obviously, one of the things that we can do as the EBRD is both investments, but combining investments with policy dialogue and policy advice, which is extremely important in terms of getting the right regulatory framework for investment in renewables.
Thank you very, very much. Mr. Tang, if I may continue with you with the next question. What impact will the expected and announced measures of central banks following, for example, the last Jackson Hole conference against inflation have on the already fragile economies, by your opinion? Are hawky and very strict interest rate anti-inflation measures the right way forward? Or to which extent should we address the fragility of our economies, especially here in Europe, from your perspective, please?
Well, let me first start let me first start by saying that it's a pleasure to be in Bled again, and to really enjoy participating in a discussion. At the same time, I've been trained as a macroeconomist, and I sometimes feel pretty useless, actually, if you want to look forward. Still, there are so many factors that you need to take into account. Well, let's start with the ordinary policies, and I think Jackson Hole was very clear that every central banker is trying to brush up their credentials. We are inflation fighters. That's what they want the public and the financial markets to believe, which is pretty difficult after 10 years of hardly any inflation at all. So that's the problem that the central bankers face, and I don't envy them. They are technocrats, but they need to impress the public opinion and need to impress the financial market, because monetary policy is much more effective if you influence expectations. And at this stage, it's not going in the right direction, right? So the one reason why we need more restrictive monetary policy, because inflation expectations are rising. Whether you look at the metrics of the financial markets, 5-year forward inflation, or you look at consumer surveys, it's very clear that inflation expectations are rising, and you need to do something to contain the expectation. But this is a difficult job for central bankers, a job they may not always be used to. In fact, politicians are very used to dealing with public opinion, but central bankers, communication is central, I think. Yet, there is the complication that what will the budgetary policies look like? So this is, I'm still in the normal realm of macroeconomics. What is the policy? Restrictive monetary policy, but we will see expansionary budgetary policy. We need to, because there need to be compensation for the hikes in energy prices. There's no doubt in my mind that as a politician, if we can't have the solidarity within our society and within the European Union, it will put severe pressure, severe strain on our societies and on the European cooperation. So now the question is, how targeted will the compensation be? How broad-based will it be? The more targeted it is, the less expansionary budgetary policy will be. But what I see is that governments very much struggle to find a targeted compensation for the increase in energy prices. So it needs to be a broad-based compensation, which makes it, in a sense, more expensive, more expansionary. And related to that, I think we should also have, also crucial is, do we tax windfall profits? Because this is also very much as a budgetary impact. And there are huge windfall profits at the usual oil and gas companies, but also at other energy suppliers. And we need to act on that. The Commission and the European Parliament are very much in favor of this, but it's now up to the member states, and I don't see much action really. But so what we see here is the clash of monetary policy being more restrictive than it has to be, and then expansionary budgetary policies. And as long as they clash, I think the adjustment period will be longer, right? So the increase in interest rates will be higher. Now, increasing interest rates, I'm happy that we also that this will also be discussed in this panel, because the things that also comes to mind is the issue of debt. The spread in interest rate. And of course, the ECB had to address it with a transmission protection instrument, which is still a bit vague, sort of improvised, it shows. But related to that, also, we see a change from Maloney to Draghi, as we expect. And this is a broader significance. We see that, right-wing populists will take probably hold of the government in Italy, as it looks right now. So what will be the reaction from the financial markets? What will be the reaction of the ECB? But also what will be the implications for the European decision making? That is one of the uncertainties that we face, and it's also crucial for the impact of monetary and budgetary policy in the year ahead.
Thank you very much. I mean, just to follow up with your thoughts, in European Union, we're actually quite unable to discuss or decide on any common tax. May it be digital tax, maybe any other tax. What kind of a chance do we have to actually find a solution here on taxation of excess profits? Do you think it's even possible that all the member states might agree on that, or what's your political view on that question?
Well, I don't say that we don't agree on taxes. So we have now the minimum effective tax rate, which was done in the OECD context, but still there's, and of course there are the outliers, first Poland and Hungary, but there's broad consensus. Before we had a digital service tax, which we agree, also European agreement, which very much pushed the US. So if you agree, it also has an impact on the outside world. So I'm just pointing out that the potential therefore is, but you don't need to maybe agree on the specifics of the taxation, but more on the policy direction. I think it's important that you tax windfall profits. It will mean less expansionary budgets, and you need the money for compensation. So so the policy direction I think is important. So you need to be on the specific, and the Commission didn't necessarily want to do that. They were just promoting this idea, and I hope very much that it will come back in the discussion in the
Thank you
next
very much. Thank you very much. Just one more. I mean, this is actually a question for more of you panelists. I mean, I go back one step to Jackson Hole, and Mr. Powell basically used Winston Churchill's words when he was explaining what they're going to do now. And, you know, Winston Churchill said, all I can promise you is sweat, blood, and tears in 1940. And in a way, he said, you know, what we're going to do now is going to cause the households quite some sweat, blood, and tears. And the same is going to happen in the European Union. Are we politically ready for that? Is the population aware of the implications it might have? In those words of Winston Churchill, they're too extreme, but, you know, it's going to be an important question. What's your opinion?
I think it's a very good question, but the fact that you have to ask this question shows that we are not really prepared. But I do see differences, though. For example, I see that the French President Emmanuel Macron really warns for the period ahead. When I consider my own country, I come from the Netherlands, I think the politics is relatively mute on that, trying to avoid the issues. Now, I think if we will, and I think that's the sense we all have here at the Blatt Strategic Forum, there will be difficult times ahead, and I think it's very good if politicians and other public figures speak out on the difficult times ahead and the need for solidarity within Europe and outside Europe. That is the only way we can confront these difficult times.
Thank you very, very much. Yes, of course, please.
Just a small remark on your interpretation of Jay Powell's words. Namely, there is a general consensus that inflation is something which is, if too high, of course, is very harmful to the whole society, to the citizens, to the business, and to the economy as a whole. So what we are trying to explain now is that, of course, our actions, removing of quantitative easing instruments and later on increases in interest rates will have some effects on the real economy, on the business sector, on the household sector. But comparing the outcome of the situation when we do not react to increasing inflation, just let inflation go, comparing this outcome to the outcome when we will increase interest rates very proportionally to what is happening with inflation, then there is a clear distinction between the outcome, and we strongly believe that the outcome we are pursuing now will be much better as compared to letting inflation go out of our control.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Ms. Lautar, for last decade, you have been active in many EU committees dealing also with the OECD, IMF, foresight groups. Let me ask you from that perspective, can you reflect on strategic role and reactions of the European Union? Do you see a room of maneuver for improvement here?
Many thanks, first of all, for invitation and to be part of that kind of distinguished panel. I think that some of your questions were already discussed and answered by Mr. Tang and Bowman, but I would still like to start with a reflection on Schuman Declaration, because I think that Europe is facing the same issue nowadays with the inflation and in the past decades with many crises. Actually, that Europe was not built in one day, but through a long path and through many different solutions. So I think that Europe now searches for this new path and takes into the account also the future share, or let me say, the future role of Europe in the whole world economy. I think that the energy crisis and the models that we are now facing with are of the extreme importance, and of course, as always, monetary and fiscal policy should work hand in hand towards the same goal. So yes, we were faced with the extreme good, precise and quick solution from European Union, that's next generation, and Mr. Bowman already mentioned RePower as a part of it, but now it's our task to use it while extremely efficiently, if I put it like this, and also to do the complementary side on the private side sector, because the fiscal policy as monetary policy cannot solve the whole problem. So the financing of this future model and also transition towards, let me say, less energy dependency on different kinds of resources is going to be a big question for us, and autumn also for the fiscal side policy is going to be extremely hot, regardless the temperature now, because we have to decide on common approach. It's not only about the exemption clause that we still have it in the next year, but it's also about really the future steps. Just one small remark on this financing from my side. I think too much focusing on only next generation or RePower will not have sufficient success. Private sector also recognize the role, and maybe it's a time that we change traditionally financing from banking side also more to the capital markets, because Europe lacks here. If we can look also on the venture capital side, that the biggest companies are not EU funded. And also, if you look at the IPOs, it's the same. So there has to be solution in financing model from EU side, member state side, plus private sector.
Thank you. I know you're very busy now with budgeting, and I mean, there's a lot going on. It's going to be a hot fall for you at the ministry. What can you tell us about I mean, you know, you can't really comment on government measures, but about fiscal policy that we can expect in Slovenia, just to tackle that question in the near future. As much as you can comment on that, would appreciate it very much.
Well, I think that it doesn't matter only on EU future fiscal politics. It does matter also our own constitutional law that was adopted. And I think that fiscal policy should be, how can I say, more fit and proper for member states, more fit and proper for the transition period that we are facing with. So what I'm arguing here is that we need a room of maneuver to prepare a proper exit strategy so that our budgets can be in structural terms more reliable, and also our path of our debts, of course we are in different groups regarding this topic, has to be more aligned with the economic cycle. So as explained, nowadays, of course, we are looking at the different kind of measures because we have to support households and companies, but we also have to look at the future steps, how is going to look how the future is going to look in terms of how we are going to boost productivity, institutional environment, etc., and also above all, how we are going to tackle our long-term structural changes that we still have. So I think that the fiscal policy, it's not going to be neither neutral, has to follow, again, the monetary path, but I think it's extremely important that we go a bit more back to the basic roots of the prudent fiscal policy, but not to the speed or to the organic sense as it would be written in some formula.
And not forget also about the long-term debt and all the issues related to that, right? Thank you very much. Mr. De Luca, last but not least, forgive me, is a global recession inevitable? The headline GDP growth has declined sharply or turned negative in several leading economies in 2022. Not in all of them, but in several. And with annual inflation in many countries, as we heard, fast approaching double digits, it's not easy to see where global growth will come from. So is a global recession inevitable, please?
Thank you, Jaka. Let me first thank the organizer for inviting me for the first time in Bled, and to congratulate with them for the success of this initiative. You asked me a prophecy, and in theory, global recession is not inevitable if central banks manage optimally the trade-off between growth and inflation. In practice, the advanced economies, if the monetary policy is not managed well, the economies, as we know, we can face really difficulties. For example, as we can see in the US, in the case of US, because of the consequence of the measures to react during the pandemic crisis, we have seen how the monetary policy has been late in tightening the economy. So in this case, for example, in US, the excessive fiscal stimulus was one of these. As you mentioned before about Powell, and is considering the negative consequence on the US economy, and it will take the risk of, in that sense, of the risk of recession. In another open question is also how deep the recession will be. In the European scenario, as we know, another question is how long the Ukraine war will last, and especially how the European economies are linked and dependent on the Russian oil and gas ration. From yesterday, Madame von der Leyen, I said that to face this problem, we should reform the market energy because the context and the condition are dramatically changed. And in September, the European member state will discuss several options. For example, the gas price cap, that is one of the Italian also proposal, and also the decoupling of the price of gas from the gas of energy. So it's important to act very, very quick on this point. And my forecast is that the recession will not be global, but for the many advanced economy is likely to happen.
United States, European Union, could be more specific?
Yes, I think that United States and
European Union, or most of member states in the European Union.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. De Luca. Just one more follow-up question. We are basically faced with a hard dilemma. How to pursue the price stability mandate without slowing down the green transition? That's a very important issue. Also, whose failure of the green transition in all we're talking about, also the energy crisis, would clearly be a danger to financial stability itself. So it's a catch-22, if I may use that book. Your comment on that?
Yes, this is a real dilemma, and we need the public sector have to share the risk with the private sector, because this is the only way to escape from this dilemma. And for example, the monetary policy could adopt the idea of the double rate interest policy, in the sense that to establish a different price level for different actors, to give you an example, and also to be to adopt policies that are predictable and certain, and that are that put in place incentive that can favorish the supply side for the investment in green finance.
Thank you very much. Mr. Governor, how resilient are the euro area banks? What lessons have we learned in the past crisis which we can use in the current one?
We learned many lessons actually during the past financial crisis almost 10 years ago, and we entered this new crisis, or these two crises, with I can use a word completely different environment regarding the supervision and regulation of the banks. So the banks were able to go through this crisis much better as compared to the previous one. And if I concentrate myself on the Slovenian banking system, which I know best, I can say that the banks are, after 2 years of COVID crisis, after Russian aggression, still very sound in terms of main or basic indicators, in terms of their capital adequacy, in terms of their liquidity. It's also worth noting that their performance in terms of soundness of their portfolio actually improved during the past year. The figure for non-performing loans is at the moment at the historical low. So our assessment is that Slovenian banks are doing much better as compared to the previous financial crisis. And of course, this was also facilitated by different response of policies, of fiscal policy, and especially of monetary policy. Let's not forget that we introduced TLTRO, a special instrument which was aimed at improving or preserving the liquidity position of the banking system in the whole euro area.
Thank you very much. And one more question, if I may continue with you, just a brief question. The euro has fallen below $1 several times during the past months, and the trend may continue. What can we expect in the near future, the euro-US dollar rate, and how will that affect global value chains and foreign trade, in your opinion?
Now, the dynamics of the exchange rate was influenced by at least three factors. The first one is, of course, the macroeconomic situation, which is at the moment quite different in Europe as compared to the US, and this is basically the main contributor, the main driving factor behind the exchange rate. Then, of course, there is a response of monetary policy, which is as a consequence of different phase of business cycle, different in the States, again, as compared to the euro area, to the ECB response, and this is also contributing to at least short-term dynamics of the exchange rate. And there is a third factor, which is also very important, and these are the effects of Russia aggression in Ukraine. And again, these effects are much bigger in Europe as compared to the States, which is a third factor which is influencing the short-term dynamics of the exchange rate.
Do you maybe can you predict, or if you may, of course, sort of a exchange rate dollar US into 2023? Now, where approximately are we going to be?
Yes, in terms of our predictions for the exchange rate, what can I say is that the dynamics of interest rate increases we are planning at the ECB will definitely reverse and lower the influence, the impact on the exchange rate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Mr. Bowman, we are in Central and Eastern Europe area. It's also important to address the area we are in right now, and the war in Ukraine, not necessarily in Slovenia, but in the broader CE region, has had a very heavy impact. And of course, you have a mandate to support economic development in that area. What is your assessment of the impact the war will have on these countries, especially bordering with the war regions, with Russia and Ukraine? What can you predict for the CE region in particular, Mr. Bowman?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. The war on Ukraine has had a very, very significant and very broad impact, and we've talked a lot about the impact on energy markets and how that's affecting all countries. If you look at the neighbouring country, you also have to appreciate the extent to which they have taken in significant number of refugees, over 1.5 million refugees. The pressures that have put on public services, on social support, on health, on education, and housing, and then this region as well, but also much broader regions. The impact that the crisis has had on food security, and to venture a little bit further, the impact, for example, on another region we're heavily involved with in North Africa. So the consequences have been very, very significant. We in the early days of the crisis, we came out with a significant support package, a 2 billion resilience and livelihood framework, helping to support Ukraine and helping to support the neighbouring countries, whether that be with energy security, with food security, or with helping to support municipalities provide basic services to populations. And we've also provided significant support to Ukraine. We are an international financial institution that continues to invest in Ukraine. We will and we are playing what I think is a critical function, doing what we can to help support the economy, working with state-owned enterprises, working with banks, working with companies in Ukraine, and we are doing that through a combination of taking risks on our own balance sheet, but also with significant support. So yes, the war in Ukraine, which is has dominated all of this discussion, has had a very significant impact in many different ways on many different regions.
Thank you very, very much. A follow-up question for you, and also we're going to ask you the same question, Mr. Tang and Mrs. Lautar. Is further deepening of the EU integration a way forward? We're talking about banking union, CMU, single market, and fiscal integration, European security architecture. I mean, is this a way forward? Do we have a consensus on that on EU level? Your opinion? Maybe this is the only way forward.
I'm sure others will want to come in on that, but let me give a sort of a broader answer to that question, and actually go back to something the Minister said in his introductory keynote, which I think was incredibly important. We face a series of different crises, whether it be the COVID recovery or the Ukraine crisis, and a very difficult few months ahead. I'm glad you didn't ask me the question about whether I was going to forecast a recession, and that reminded me about the joke about economists. The economists have predicted 5 of the last 2 recessions, or whatever the number is. But it's going to be a very significant time. I think one very important lesson is that international cooperation is going to be extremely important, and in these times of crisis, ensuring that countries don't turn inwards, that the countries continue to cooperate, continue to trade, don't close off markets. I think that is an extremely important policy message.
Mr. Tang, your opinion?
Well, members from the European Parliament usually say that. Yeah. But there are good reasons to say that we want better, stronger and deeper European cooperation, especially in hectic times. But let me try to twist this a bit. What I see, what I find concerning, and what was partly addressed by von der Leyen yesterday in her speech, I see that we have become, and it was also alluded to by the Minister, Hahn, who said we come from an era of liberalization and cheap prices. We have become very fragile, very vulnerable to economic shocks. There was the banking system where we didn't have enough buffers. It's the current energy crisis where we didn't have enough buffers. So we built systems, rather complex systems, without the buffers in there. And she would like to think that we can do better than that, and that we need to address the issue of vulnerability and fragility much more. And we need to rethink our trade and our competition policies.
We're talking European Union level now.
European Union. This needs to be done at European level. To think about strategically, what is our position vis-a-vis China and Russia and China? What is our relation to the African continent? But we also need to think about the dependency that we have. We are, for example, our chips are mainly produced in Taiwan. Our social media are in the hands of big tech. And somehow someone said to me, we have fallen asleep. I didn't like that expression, but we sort of suppressed our concern on this, but I think they are back with a vengeance. We had too many crises in my political career, started with the financial crisis, but the pandemic, the energy crisis we have right now. We need to really rethink our policies and make our economies and societies more resilient.
War in Ukraine, Russian aggression on Ukraine undoubtedly connected the continent more than almost anything in the last decade or 2 decades, or maybe even since the fall of Berlin Wall. There is no doubt about that. However, my question was not, as a member of European Parliament, absolutely or in favor of deeper integration. But it was, do we have a consensus for that? And look, Italian elections are coming up. Mr. De Luca is going to comment on that also. I'm not talking about Mrs. Meloni. She was attending this forum last year here. I'm just talking generally. There might be a shift in policy, in beliefs and strategies in many member states of the European Union. We come together because of the war, but then again, we're falling apart for some other issues. And that's going to be a crucial question. Just a brief thought on that. We're running out of time. And then Mr. De Luca to comment on that also, and then Mrs. Lautar also, please.
I think it's a very good question. I'm not sure I know the answer, so let alone a short answer. Let me just remind you, I was yesterday at the night owl session with CSEC, and he said, the Ukrainians fight for Europe, but Europeans forgot to fight for Europe themselves. Some words to that effect, and I think this is where we need to refine our spirit and defend our societies and our economies, not just within Europe, also for our neighbors. And that's what we need to find to live through these times and to do better than before.
The role of the institutions will be as crucial as ever in that. Mr. De Luca, maybe you can also comment on the Italian prediction, but generally on the integration one and stepping together again.
I listened to the philosopher Slavoj Zizek speech, and I was really positively impressed by his the phrase that he said that Ukraine are more European than us, in the sense that they can teach us, they can help us to face hard times and difficulties. And we should remember how Europe will be, has been constructed, built on these kind of difficulties and sacrifices. So that's why we have to cooperate, and also the Balkans and the integration, the role of the Serbia, that was one very tricky one in that sense. And I think that this call for cooperation is also important for the Italian next election. If I can say something on this.
Yes.
Yes, and our Prime Minister, Mario Draghi, in his last speech, said that whoever will win our election, they will succeed in face this hard time. And if the trust is at the basis of financial market and also the basis of political consensus. So it's a matter of expectation, how to influence it. In the case that Fratelli d'Italia will win, I think that this call for the national interest, and most importantly, their position in the side of Euro-Atlantic ideology is very good for us. They say that they are in the Atlantic Transatlantic League, and they think that we are too close to Europe and to US, United States. And I can mention something that is on the Italian newspaper, that most of the ministers that will be appointed by Fratelli d'Italia will come from experts outside the party. And some of politicians that are inside Fratelli d'Italia is doing a good job. For example, Honorable Adolfo Urso, that is president of the Italian Parliamentary Committee for the Surveillance of the Intelligence. It is a very delicate job. He's a parliamentary, but was former minister. So I understand that there is some, of course, prejudice, concerns about this. But
Italy is not an insignificant country.
Of course.
And the debt is also not
Yes,
insignificant.
yes.
So there's a lot of things that are concerning us, to be very honest.
I trust to Mario Draghi that is for many of us is a paradigm in Italy. And
Of course. But we're not here to talk Italy in general. It's just another concern. We're so focused on Ukraine, which is absolutely right, and we're focused on energy crisis and everything else. But there's also potential crisis. Can you hear me? Okay, I have a deep voice, right? You can hear me better this way. Anyway, Mrs. Lautar, I'm sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Just like an explosion. But anyway, Mrs. Lautar, your thoughts, your comments on what we've heard about integration. We also talked before the panel that you're going to address that issue. There's some new styles of management also feasible in the European Union. What's your opinion?
President of the Commission speech, but even more, I was interested what is going to say Olaf Scholz about the integration of the Europe. And here I see a crucial step that Europe has to remain on their own solidarity and common values that we have delivered. But we have to go a step forward. And it's about the governance, and it's about the new structures that have to come quickly if we want to succeed our path in this dangerous way, you know. I didn't want to quote, Jaka knows what I'm going to say, but I think that Europe should do something similar like back in the 60s Kennedy has done with the NASA project on man on the moon, you know. So if the Commission and presidencies and also the biggest economists are advocating through Macron and Scholz for different governance, there is a room of maneuver to improve it. And above all, we cannot share or spend trillions or billions of money again if we did not tackle the structure of those billions and trillions that are spent, and we did not address the risk. I think that Mr. Tang and Bowman has said exactly the same. So yes, solidarity, common values, future integration, but new governance in terms of new management styles are really necessary for the Europe.
Was not going to explode also. Sorry about that. But I know there's some buzzwords we have at the forum we shouldn't mention. It's again, sorry about that, guys. Anyway, I think we're just about time for our keynote listener. 5-7 minutes. Mr. Collen Vixen, Kelapile, permanent representative of Botswana to the United Nations, is going to share a few thoughts with us on what we heard also from the African perspective and perspective of United Nations. And then he's going to ask 1 or 2 questions also to you at the panel. And of course, later on, we can give the microphone also to you if you have any questions for our distinguished guests. So please.
I believe it's best I stand, so I don't give you my back. So let me first of all thank our hosts, especially the government of Slovenia, for bringing us all the way. We are based in New York, and I see my dear colleague Rhonda is also here to be part of this very important forum. It's very timely. It's really good that we are talking about the issues of vulnerability and fragility, which we are also addressing in New York. What I've heard so far from the panelists, and also, of course, the minister's keynote address, it resonates very well with us who have spent time in the multilateral system, and we have recently also been doing the same assessment of where the global economy stands and where we are headed. And the very fears that you have also sounded are similarly fears in New York. And I commend you for the expert job that you have done to identify all the challenges. But I believe the question is how do we get out of this? There are many variables that you have spelled out: the inflationary pressure, the sluggish economic growth, and of course, that coming also in the context of a severely challenged environment due to COVID-19, and also now adding the implications of the war in Ukraine. We in the UN, and I think you contributed to this project, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its 17 goals. From what we want to believe is that when these goals were adopted in 2015, they already added the ambition that was required, which places us in a better position to be able to leverage, the SDGs as a means to recovery. What is needed in order to get there? We know we are short of time now. We are almost halfway. Yes, I'm getting there. We are almost halfway to the end point, 2030. What we need is to take advantage of the situation around us and accelerate the implementation of the SDGs. So let me, having said that, I know when I told you I had 4 questions, you have told me there won't be time to raise all of them. Yes, I will just pick on, say, 2 of them. I was happy to hear that apart from the discussion having been mainly in the context of Europe and the neighboring countries in the region, the link to the rest of the globe. I'm an African, obviously. I'm going to be very biased. Given what was said that we do not know when the war in Ukraine will end, and considering the dependency on both the Russian Federation and Ukraine, which is also true for Europe, some of your big countries depend, we in our own region have been found actually very vulnerable in the sense that we are also dependent on the same source for different commodities. What, for the meantime, would be your advice? Since we don't know when the war is going to end, what would be your advice, especially to the most vulnerable, who, as I said, include countries from Africa? What should we be doing now? Would you think that in terms of food security, energy could be a little challenging? Food security, we want to believe as Africa that given the, the large advantage we have in terms of the arable land, we are capable of feeding ourselves and actually even feeding the whole world. What kind of policies would you recommend to the African continent, for example, in order to ensure that really happens? Because we know the potential is there. So the second one, which is the last one, we also have our regional groups, regional bodies, the AU, you have the EU. What can the EU do more beyond concentration of efforts in the region to also share experiences in order to ensure an inclusive recovery, especially from COVID-19? So let me end it there. I know there's no time. I had more to say.
Of course. And there might be a little bit more time at the end. Thank you very, very much for those questions. And maybe I can supplement one is that climate change is absolutely something that you are absolutely also very, very interested in, having proper answers from our side also on that question. Who wants to answer the first, second question? Mr. Bowman, would you like to? You have the microphone there.
Can I use this one? This one won't blow up.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. I mean, the question on Africa and food security, we as the EBRD are active, not in all of Africa, but in North Africa. I don't think I have a particularly comprehensive answer, but there's a kind of immediate challenge, which is a logistical challenge in terms of getting food sources out of Ukraine across the Black Sea. We're all familiar with the kind of challenges of the Black Sea and what can be done there, and that by far is the very significant amounts of food come through that Black Sea routes. There's work being done in terms of alternative routes, whether by truck, by train, or whatever, but very difficult to meet the scale that can be transported by sea. And I guess that's a lot of work being done internationally and also in New York on this. In terms of the kind of more medium term, I think you sort of almost answered your own question, but there presumably is massive potential for African countries to increase their own production by improving their agricultural policies, by diversifying sources of supply. And I guess, back to a previous comment about what can be done to kind of improve resilience, including improving resilience of global food supply chains. That's one of the challenges that we need to face up to.
Thank you very much. Mr. Tang, would you like to answer the second question or maybe comment on it? European Union, what can we do more?
Well, building on Mark, I think resilience would be a key word, and that goes in many directions. It's about food security. I think that's been an old discussion we always have in, let's say, about developing economies. How do we make sure that there are not shocks to the system, both for the producers and for the consumers? And I think that's a common interest that we have between Africa and Europe. And once Europe finally start to rethink its vulnerability and its fragility, I think this one should be back on the table. But it also, and I think Van der Leyen was also alluding to that yesterday, we also need to build strong political relations, given the interdependencies that we have in the world. And one way to be resilient is to have this good and reciprocal relations to come up with answers for questions we did not know, for events we did not foresee. I think it's crucial that we have good cooperation.
All right, thank you very much. We have 5 more minutes, and there is also potentially other questions from the audience. You have a great chance to ask our distinguished guests if there is any. Mr. Arhar, former governor of the Bank of Slovenia.
Thank you very much for the word. Very interesting discussions anyway. But look, if we speak on price stability, for me, it's very clear that price stability is the first task for the central bank. For European one, on the first position. We know in United States, central bank has 2 tasks. One is price stability, and on the other side, its level of unemployment. 2 instruments has central bank in own hands. The first one is money quantity. If you compare the figures, what's happened in last decade related to money quantity, you can state that huge amount of money was issued, roughly 6 billion or trillion in the language of United States. Similar situation in United States. On the other side, please, what's happened, the second instrument, interest rate. What's happened with interest rate? We have been faced very long time with -1. Do you remember which was situation before financial crisis? European level of inflation rate was by 4.5%. And ECB came with basic interest rate to 4.25%, please. And they have had the ambition to increase it in addition, but then on September 15 came Lehman Brothers. So that, no doubt, for me, the first responsibility is in the hands of central bank. If we speak on energy, on exchange rates and so on, don't forget following. IMF organized annual meeting on the 8th of September 2000 in Prague. 2 issues have been the key question. On one side, the exchange rate of euro versus US dollar. Do you remember as euro came on the market, the rate was 1.18. And on the end of September 2000 came down to 0.84. $0.84 for 1 euro. And the second question was, which will be a situation with energy prices, with oil prices. Don't forget it, that Russia declared bankruptcy in August 98, before euro came. Why? Due to the fact that the price came down to $9 for 1 barrel of oil. And that means, on one side, the question in 2000, how to stop the growth of crisis for energy, and the question or the answer came from United States. Mr. Clinton announced to the world, United States will supply additional oil, and all was stopped now. So that, excuse me, own experience is the best school for all of us. And we know in this small country, which was situation with inflation, with hyperinflation, and on the first position was quantity of money. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arhar, for this. It was a comment. He added something to our panel. You don't have a concrete question probably for our panel, right? Thank you very much. Would anybody want to comment? Yeah, please.
Well, the ECB also needs to think about its legitimacy. So it's true that they need to address price stability. But I once asked Stanley Fischer about the differences between the US and the EU. So the ECB has a single mandate, the EU, the Fed has a double mandate. And he was surprisingly relaxed about it. You can't be a central banker and just focus on inflation. You need to look at the social, the economic impact of your actions. And that is true. This is why I also come up with the issue of the transmission protection instruments. It's all about the legitimacy. So central bankers are not outside our society, are outside our economy, they are within. And even though you think that inflation, and you can perfectly have that position that inflation and price stability is very important, I personally like to think that central bankers have a broader need to think broader than that, and just focus on inflation, but also on the economic impact of their measures. And I would not distrust central bankers if they did not. And this is my sort of
all right.
broad support.
Thank you very much. I know there's more questions. I know we could have another half an hour. It's a really broad topic. But guys, we're over. There's another panel going on. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for being with us in this rather hot room. Some of us managed to have the jackets on. Have a beautiful continuation of the Bled Strategic Forum, and I hope to see you all next year. Thank you very much, and thank you to the panel. Thank you.